You've heard the tales of the Islamic Golden Age, shimmering cities, libraries of boundless knowledge, and philosophers who lit up the medieval world. But there's a darker mirror to this light, one that history rarely dares to reflect. Beneath the brilliance of Baghdad and Cordoba, something else was happening, something brutal, calculated, and nearly invisible to the modern eye. Entire civilizations vanished, not just conquered but culturally erased. And the records? They exist, penned not by outsiders, but by Islamic chroniclers themselves. This is the part of history you were never meant to hear. Until now. If you're watching this, you're one of the curious few who want to go beyond the headlines. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This story is the kind they don't teach in school, and we're just getting started. When Islamic caliphates began their meteoric rise in the 7th century, they brought with them a transformative religious and political force. Their military victories were swift. Arabia, Persia, North Africa, and large swaths of Byzantium fell like dominoes. But what followed the sword was far more enduring. It was not just about land, it was about identity. The strategy wasn't merely conquest, it was absorption and erasure. Conquered peoples were allowed to live, but only as shadows of their former selves. Their languages, customs, even the names of their cities were slowly replaced. Arabic became the mother tongue. Non-Muslims were taxed, sidelined, or pressured into conversion through policies that made survival itself a daily negotiation. And when they couldn't be integrated, they were silenced, permanently. Perhaps the most haunting example is the Devshirme system of the Ottoman Empire. Every few years, Ottoman officials swept through Christian villages in the Balkans, seizing young boys, not for ransom, but for transformation. These were not just abductions, they were identity extractions. Stripped from their families, converted to Islam, trained as elite soldiers, janissaries, and taught to believe the Sultan had saved them. Their own parents were painted as ignorant pagans, their faith a relic, their past erased. It worked. These children, torn from home, would one day return, not as sons, but as invaders, as Muslims, enforcing the very system that stole their names. Imagine that, a brother taken by force, returning years later in armor, sword drawn, chanting the verses of the empire that remade him. But this was just one strand in a vast, complex web, an imperial blueprint where warfare, religion, and cultural domination were engineered to operate hand in hand. A conquest not just of territory, but of memory itself. And if you think that's where it ends, you're wrong. In the next section, we follow the trail of blood, into the slave markets, castration chambers, and harems, where a different kind of war was being waged. One that didn't target cities, but bodies. To understand the scale of domination, you must leave the battlefield and step into the back rooms of conquest, the marketplaces, the caravan routes, the blood-slicked floors of castration chambers. Here, the war was quiet and permanent. The Islamic slave trade, unlike its Atlantic counterpart, wasn't a single burst of brutality. It was a slow, enduring engine that spanned 1,400 years, from the 7th century to the early 20th. It reached across continents, swallowing Africans, Slavs, Indians, Greeks, Armenians, and more. But this was not slavery as you've seen it depicted. This was annihilation dressed in ritual. Boys, selected for strength and youth, were captured and castrated, often without anesthesia. The mortality rate? A staggering 90%. It wasn't just cruelty, it was design. The goal was clear: eliminate the possibility of rebellion, family, legacy. What emerged from this process wasn't a man, it was a tool. The survivors became eunuchs. Some guarded royal harems, others performed administrative duties. But their presence, everywhere, served a deeper psychological function: submission. And the women? If they were beautiful, they were destined for the haram. A word that once meant sanctuary became a gilded prison. Rulers like Harun al-Rashid, praised in tales of Arabian Nights, kept thousands of concubines, not wives, not partners, property. Women torn from the Balkans, the Caucasus, Africa, Central Asia, women who never saw their families again. Their children were often denied inheritance. Their existence was erased in royal lineage, even when they gave birth to future rulers. But what makes this system so disturbing is not just its cruelty, it's how systematic it was. There were laws governing which slaves could be touched, sold, bred, or discarded. Scholars justified every detail. Verses from the Quran about those whom your right hand possesses were twisted into lifelong sentences of servitude. Entire markets were devoted to sex slaves. Naked girls were inspected like cattle in Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and it was accepted, not hidden, not shameful, written about in detail by travelers like Ibn Battuta and chroniclers who considered it part of everyday life. The ripple effects? Catastrophic. African regions were emptied of young men. Christian and Hindu girls disappeared without trace. Families disfigured their daughters to make them undesirable. Others locked them indoors. And yet, this wasn't seen as barbarism by those who ran it. It was seen as righteous control, a method of turning conquered bodies into compliant flesh. So while Europe was building cities and reforming feudal systems, vast parts of the Islamic world were perfecting a machine, one where the human soul was reshaped to serve the Caliphate. But the most brutal part was still to come. Because when you've broken the body, what's left is to erase the spirit, the language, the rituals, the gods. And that would be the most permanent conquest of all. When swords fell silent and slave markets were filled, a new conquest began, not of land or people, but of memory. This was not the work of soldiers. It was the silent labor of scribes, scholars, governors, and imams. And it was devastating. In the newly conquered lands of Egypt, Persia, India, and North Africa, mosques rose on the ruins of temples. Libraries were emptied, scrolls were burned, and languages, living, sacred tongues, were declared obsolete. Arabic replaced everything, not just in religious spaces, but in courts, schools, even poetry. Coptic, once the language of ancient Egyptian Christians, vanished except in isolated monasteries. Persian Zoroastrians, who had kept sacred fires burning for over 1,000 years, saw their temples smashed and their texts reduced to ash. Priests were killed or forcibly converted. Entire religions collapsed. This wasn't the chaotic rage of vandals. It was state policy. Even names were rewritten. Cities like Alexandria and Ctesiphon were renamed. Festivals, Nowruz, Diwali, Saturnalia, were banned or declared un-Islamic. Churches were allowed to remain standing only if they predated the conquest, and even then repairs were forbidden. No new temples, no processions, no bells. If you were not Muslim, your faith had to hide. And then there was the tax, the jizya. It wasn't just a financial burden, it was humiliation by design. Non-Muslims had to pay in person, sometimes struck or spat upon as they handed over their coin. It was a reminder, you live here by permission. This is why entire cultures collapsed without a fight. Not because they lacked courage, but because they were suffocated slowly, economically, linguistically, spiritually. Piece by piece, they forgot how to remember who they were. The greatest irony? Many Islamic scholars and rulers saw this as mercy. They believed they were saving souls, replacing false gods with one true God, bringing order to chaos. And to be fair, many among the conquered eventually believed it too. Generations born after conquest knew no other story. They spoke Arabic. They prayed facing Mecca. They saw their grandparents' faith as something quaint or even dangerous. And so, the real victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the mind. Today, entire civilizations, Coptic Egypt, Zoroastrian Persia, Vedic kingdoms of India, exist only as museum relics or obscure entries in books. Their temples are ruins, their chants silenced. This wasn't just cultural loss, it was cultural design. But if the destruction of the soul was brutal, what funded it was even more calculated. Because in the final section, we pull back the curtain on the economics of conquest and learn how wealth itself became a weapon of submission. The final blow didn't come from armies or imams, it came from accountants. After the battles were won, the real machinery of control began through taxes, tribute, and economic restructuring. The goal was simple: make resistance impossible by making survival conditional. In conquered lands, a system of kharaj, land tax, and jizya, head tax, was imposed. But these weren't standard levies. They were set at confiscatory levels, often 50 to 80% of agricultural output. Farmers had to choose, feed their children or pay the state, and when they couldn't pay, their land was seized and redistributed, usually to Muslim settlers. Suddenly, native populations became tenants on their own soil, dependent, powerless. And this wasn't arbitrary, it was codified. In Egypt, sophisticated irrigation systems dating back to the pharaonic era were left to rot. Not due to ignorance, but policy. Prosperity bred independence. Poverty bred obedience. In Persia, the ancient Sasanian taxation structure was gutted and replaced by caliphate demands that redirected wealth to Baghdad and Damascus. The result? Once thriving regions like Khuzestan and Mesopotamia became agricultural husks, producing just enough to fuel the caliphate's war machine. But even that wasn't enough. The caliphates demanded not just goods, but people. The Nubians were forced to send 400 slaves annually to the Fatimids. Balkan Christians had to provide sons for Ottoman armies. These weren't occasional tributes, they were quotas, recurring, enforced. Trade was also restricted. Non-Muslims were excluded from profitable sectors or forced to pay steep commercial taxes. Merchants who refused to convert found themselves locked out of guilds, denied licenses, or targeted for extortion. The message was clear: convert or collapse. And many did. Not because they believed, but because belief became the only path to food, shelter, and dignity. Over generations, these conversions were internalized. Today, many Muslim communities trace their ancestry to these forced transitions, unknowingly. Even the Waqf system, religious land trusts, was used as an economic weapon. Conquered lands were turned into endowments that funded mosques, madrasas, and bureaucracies. These lands became permanently removed from the hands of the conquered, enshrining their dispossession in divine legal terms. This wasn't looting, it was systematic economic redesign. The legacy? Regions that had once rivaled Rome in wealth and complexity became dependent provinces. Cultures that had stood for millennia became silent. Economies collapsed, not because of natural decline, but engineered starvation, and the world forgot. But you haven't. Because you're still here, listening, seeking the truth they buried under gold domes and grand narratives. And that truth is this: conquest doesn't always come with swords. Sometimes it comes with silence.